Well, hello and welcome to High Impact Volunteer Recruitment. I'm Andy King with the Corporation for National and Community Service. I serve as a training specialist for the AmeriCorps Vista program, and I'll be your host for today's presentation. Joining us today are Bethany DeSablin and Joanne Lau, our partners at Education Northwest, who have helped to prepare our webinar today. They're managing all of our WebEx technology and producing the session. So you'll see all of us in the chat and the Q&A to help address your questions and provide you support during the session. Now it's a great honor for me to welcome our main speaker today. Rick Lynch is a Seattle-based management consultant, and he's a featured speaker on volunteer management at international, national, and state conferences, and he's been doing this for more than 30 years. He has presented volunteer management workshops in the United States, Canada, Australia, Britain, Ireland, Russia, Brazil, and Singapore. And he's co-author of the book Volunteer Management, which just happens to be the best-selling book in its field in the US, China, and in Ukraine. The British version is called The Complete Volunteer Management Handbook, and it's also the best-selling book in the UK in the field of volunteer management. Mr. Lynch has served on the board of directors of a number of organizations, including a volunteer center, a retired volunteer program, a United Way, national and local literacy programs, and the National CASA, an organization that ensures that abused children are placed in safe and permanent homes. Among other roles in the field, Rick has served as a volunteer coordinator and as the training director of the Washington State Office of Voluntary Action. He also is a supervisor of Vista Volunteers in Huntsville, Alabama, and he's a Vista alum himself from Vista's third class of Vistas in 1968. A little later on in today's session, we're going to hear from one of your fellow Vista members, Sarah Penn, who serves at the at the Mayor's office in Augusta, Georgia. So let's take a look at what we hope you'll get out of today's webinar. By the end of this session, we'd like you to be able to identify 4 methods of recruiting volunteers. We hope you'll be able to describe 7 steps of the targeted recruitment process that we're going to walk you through. And finally, that you'll be able to create a targeted recruitment message to reach the audience that you've identified. So with that set up, I'm now going to turn it over to Rick Lynch. Rick?
Thanks, Andy, and thanks for making me sound so old. I'm very glad to be here. I'd like to start our discussion of recruitment with a general principle of volunteer management, which is so basic that it's kind of embarrassing to even bring it up. It's probably the most basic of all volunteer management principles. And that is simply to make sure volunteers are doing something that they want to do. This is a very simple and somewhat obvious statement, but there are many sophisticated implications of this statement. For recruitment, the implication is that rather than recruitment being something about selling somebody on doing something that they're not that crazy about doing, it's simply showing people that they can do something they already want to do. In communities, there are people who are concerned with a variety of different things. And so if you have a need for a particular volunteer, the idea is there already are out there in the community people who want to do the thing that you need done. And so recruitment is simply the process of letting people know there's an opportunity to do that. There are 4 main ways in which people have traditionally gone about recruitment. And each of these has its own pluses and minuses. The first of these is the warm body approach. This is basically sending a message in general to the community at large, letting them know that we need volunteers. There is usually no particular mention of any skills that are necessary or any particular qualifications or any motivations. It's just simply letting people know that we're in need of volunteers. Here is an example of a warm body approach that I saw once. It just simply says, volunteers to work in various departments at Truman College. And there's it's kind of amazing that people actually do respond to these messages. And in fact, one of the minuses of using the warm body approach is that people may imagine they have an opportunity to do something that you didn't really have in mind. When I see volunteers are needed to work in various departments, I might see myself on a stage in a giant lecture hall with 300 eager freshmen eager to lap up my various philosophies, and when I come in and discover that wasn't what you wanted, then it's basically a waste of your time and mine. So warm body is okay in some circumstances. If you need large numbers of people for an event and you have a job that appeals to large numbers of people, and if you have a job that appeals to skills that practically everybody has, such as hugging special athletes or cheering for special athletes. Not my favorite method. The next one is one that is, I'm having trouble advancing the slide here, hold on. Next one is one that my co-author of the book Volunteer Management called the concentric circles approach. The idea here is that the volunteers you already have are part of various social circles. They have friends they hang out with. There are people they work with. And the people that they know and get along with and spend time with tend to be people who are similarly motivated and similarly oriented philosophically to them. And so the volunteers you have will kind of, if they tell their friends about their experience, and if they're having a good experience, their friends are likely to come forward also. The great thing about concentric circles is it doesn't require any work. Volunteers just magically appear. The downside of this is you get people just like the ones you've already got. And that may not be all that bad if you have a nice, diverse group of people already. But one of the things that happens is that as people age, the people who come forward through volunteers, through this method of recruitment, are also aging. And if you look at the average hospital volunteer program in the United States right now, you can see the fruits of this, because hospitals have used concentric circles recruitment forever. And back when their volunteers were 40 years old, this was super. But if you go to the average hospital program now, you'll see there's a crisis, because in some of them, the youngest person is older than I am, and they are on the verge of becoming patients themselves and maybe dying. So there is a downside to this. You can make concentric circles work a little better by suggesting to your volunteers that they might do this more intentionally and try to recruit their friends. You can also ask staff of the agency to talk to their friends and see if they would be interested in coming forward if this is something they want to do. A third method of recruitment is the brokered approach. Again, this has the advantage of being relatively easy. This is getting somebody else to recruit the volunteers for you. In some communities, there are volunteer centers that still do this kind of thing. In some communities, there are newspapers that still have a volunteers are needed column that runs every so often. Another opportunity would be websites such as Volunteer Match. Talk a little bit about that later on. That You can actually, you have to pay to get your recruitment message in, but it takes care of, they essentially do all the work, so to speak. Another approach that's an example of brokered would be to get a service club involved, and you have to recruit the service club bigwigs, but then they show up with the people, they do all the recruiting. And if you have events like a community cleanup or something, that's often a good way to go. What we're going to spend the most time on here is the fourth method of recruitment, which is the targeted volunteer recruitment method. I should warn you at the outset that this has the disadvantage of requiring thinking and work. The idea here behind the targeted method is that instead of sending one message to the community at large, we're going to send a number of messages to the community, each of which is focused on a particular segment of the community. And this has an advantage because when you send a general message out, when you send a message to people in general, you often wind up speaking to no one in particular. I notice a couple of you are working with CASA, which is an organization near and dear to my heart. As Andy mentioned, I used to be on the national board of CASA. And if I were trying to recruit CASA volunteers in a community that had a university, one of the places that I would go to try to recruit CASA volunteers would be the social work department, and to see if I could get an opportunity to speak to students who are getting their master's in social work. And the reason I would do this is that as a CASA volunteer, you gain a lot of knowledge about how the child welfare system works and how the juvenile court system works, and you may in fact wind up doing battle with the child welfare system. And as a consequence, you will learn a lot of stuff about how it works that you might not actually learn in school. And you also will have a leg up on the competition when you go looking for a job as a social worker if you're going into the field of child welfare, because you've actually had some experience with the system. But if I were going to try to send a message to the community at large, the message about learning about the child welfare system and getting a job as a social worker would fall on deaf ears in 99% of the cases. So I would tend not to mention that. And when I didn't mention that, a student in social work who heard the message might not figure out that actually this is something that they want to do, because I wouldn't be speaking directly to their motivational needs. When we talk about targeting the message, we are talking about speaking directly to the target group's concerns, hopes, fears, needs, wants, wishes, desires, dreams, the things that kind of make them tick. And by doing that, we are able to show them that here is a job that will enable them to alleviate their concerns or their fears, or to burnish their hopes and dreams, or to solve the things that they are concerned about. And so this is, in my view, the more effective way of going about recruiting. It does require that you come up with different messages for different target groups. Another target group that I would maybe try to target with CASA is patrolling police officers, who are often the first person to arrive at the scene of a domestic violence incident. And if there are children involved, the officer is there when the social worker comes and takes the child away, and they often wind up wondering whatever happened to that kid. And so one of the things I would stress with that target group is you can be part of the end of the story for the child. Get them into a safe and permanent home. This idea of targeting comes from the awful field of advertising. And when you see an effective advertisement, and it's amazing that not all advertisements are very effective. Some advertisements that people spend millions of dollars on actually don't much move the needle for the product being sold. But when you see one that is effective, you will tend to see three elements. The first of these is that there is a target audience. Very rarely do you see an effective ad that does not have a particular demographic group in mind. And the second element would be that there is a motivational theme. The message in the advertisement speaks to the concerns, needs, hopes, dreams, desires, fears of the target audience. And the third one of these is that there's some kind of spokesperson that's not always a person, sometimes it's an object, but it's something that the target group can look at and say, yeah, that's me they're talking to. They can relate to either the person or the object. I'll give you an example of this. One of the most effective advertisements in the history of advertising, I think, might have come as a surprise to the people who first put this together, because they spent practically no money on this television commercial. It was a television commercial that aired a long time ago. It was a commercial for Michelin tires. And one of the things about the commercial was during the entire commercial, the camera never moved and the scene never changed. So for like 30 seconds, you were just seeing the same thing, which was a stage with a black curtain behind it. On the stage was a tire. So since Michelin already has tires, so far they haven't spent any money for somebody to zoom the camera. They haven't spent any money on so to speak, to make a fancy place or anything. Now, sitting inside the tire was a baby, just old enough to sit up. And it was a cute baby. They might have had to pay extra for cuteness, but it's a baby. How good a deal can he negotiate? And during the entire 30 seconds, the baby just sat there. Off camera, and the Screen Actors Guild has a thing that if we just use your voice, we don't have to pay you as much as if you're actually seen on screen. Off camera, two adults are having a conversation. And their conversation is about whether they should buy the Michelin tires or save a few bucks and buy the cheap tires. And after some deliberation, they decide to buy the Michelin tires. All the while they're talking, you're just looking at the baby sitting there looking cute. Then there's a little tagline that crawled across the screen, Michelin, because so much is riding on your tires. So if you could, in the chat, just answer this question: who is the target audience of this advertisement? Parents would be the correct answer.
Yeah, almost everyone said the same.
What is the motivational theme? What are the concerns that they're trying to appeal to here? Yes, safety and protection. Protect your young, a deep, primordial motivational theme wired into the brain of practically every creature on the planet. And the spokesperson is obviously the baby, who doesn't say a word, but just by sitting there being cute and helpless speaks volumes You know, my safety is your responsibility. You need to step up to the plate and buy some good tires. Now, you might imagine a different Michelin ad aimed at a different market segment. Let's take the macho male market segment. This would be a market segment that would not want wimpy family car tires on their vehicle, which is doubtless an off-road vehicle. And this particular market segment, unlike 90% of the people in America who own off-road vehicles, actually drives their vehicle off the road. And there'd be a different kind of spokesperson. It would probably be a macho male, somebody with muscles who'd probably be sweating and maybe sitting in the front seat of a pickup truck with a gun rack behind him and a pet wolf sitting next to him. And there you'd see the tires going over rocks and the rocks splitting and snakes scurrying out of the way. And there'd be a different kind of tagline, Michelin, the tires tough enough to take it and dish it out, something like that. The same product we're selling, tires, but two different messages, because people are more likely to move, to take the action you want them to take, to become a volunteer or to buy a product, if it is focused directly at them. Whoops. So I'm going to give you some steps now. And if there are 7 of these, and if you just make note of these as we go through them, then it makes it pretty easy to plan a targeted recruitment campaign. These are all in the form of questions, and so if you just answer the questions, you will come up with a really good, effective, targeted recruitment campaign. And the advantage of this is that you're likely to get volunteers that are the right kind of volunteers, the kind you're looking for with the abilities that you're looking for, the characteristics you're looking for. So the first question is, what is the job that needs to be done? Now, you can also start with a target group, but if we're looking at this kind of systematically, we'd have some jobs that we're trying to recruit people to do, and while many of you were waiting for this to start, I noticed a lot of you had done that step already. The next question is one that people tend not to ask, and that question is, who would want to do that? Who out there, what kind of person already wants to do that particular job? Let me give you an example of this. I was doing a workshop in New York City years and years ago, and wasn't even on recruitment. But when I asked for questions, somebody raised her hand and she said, I've been in this field for more than 20 years, and I've never had any problem recruiting volunteers. And her agency was kind of a youth-serving agency, did mentoring and tutoring and stuff. She said, we have a new job in my agency that I just can't get anybody to do. I said, what's the job? She said, it's to escort children to school. Now that sounds innocuous enough, but as she continued to describe it, it became apparent why she was having difficulty, because the children in question lived in very dangerous neighborhoods in New York City, and the distance for them between home and school was kind of scary. It was populated by people making them interesting offers, such as join our gang or we'll beat you up every day. Or it was populated by people trying to recruit them to sell drugs or to buy drugs. It was populated by people ready to steal anything they owned. And the nice suburban women from Bergen County, New Jersey, that she'd had no problem recruiting for her tutoring programs, took one look at this and wanted no part of it. I asked her, what have you tried? And she said, I've tried downplaying the danger. I said, how has that worked? She said, it's gotten some of them to do it once. But she had never asked this second question. Who would want to do that job? And maybe just on the chat, you might throw in some ideas about target groups that you can think of, because New York City has every target group imaginable and some unimaginable. But what kind of person would want to do the job? And I see police officers, and I see, and that's good, because police officers might be familiar with the area, not as freaked out by it. Reformed gang members, off-duty police, military. There's no military. Someone says macho men, all right. So these are all, this is the kind of thinking that you want to do with this step. It just so happened that I happened to have with me at that point a slide. Wasn't part of my presentation to the group, but I had just happened to have it with me. That I showed her. This is a recruitment appeal made by a guy named Ernest Shackleton, who in 1917 set out on a voyage to be the first to the South Pole. And he put a little classified ad in the Times in London, and the ad read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger," and then my favorite phrase, "safe return, doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success." People came out of the woodwork in response to this ad, the macho men that you mentioned before. And she took one look at this and realized she'd been doing this all wrong. And she was inspired by this to take her recruitment appeal to places that she had never thought of going before. She went to boxing clubs and karate studios. She went to the Columbia University football team and said, "I'd like to talk to some of the players. No quarterbacks, thank you. Do you have some defensive linemen I could talk to?" And then she stumbled upon an organization that solved all of her recruitment problems. In New York City, at this time at any rate, I'm not sure if it's still there, but there was actually a professional association of bouncers, the people that throw rowdy people out of bars. These people had the perfect personality for the child escort job because they were used to people trying to out-macho them, and they had had success. They also had never been asked to do anything socially redeeming in their entire lives, and they jumped at this chance. But this was an organization that had officers, a newsletter, the whole thing, and it solved her problem just completely. You might imagine a recruitment appeal. Are you man enough to escort a child to school? Something like that. The next step in targeted recruiting, after looking at who would want to do this, is to ask, what do they do instead of volunteering for us? And we ask this question because the answer to it will give us some clues in answering the next question, which is, where are they? If we're going to communicate with them, then we need to be able to figure out, well, where can we get together with them in order to communicate? So there are a variety of different kinds of answers to that question. In some kinds of cases, there may be places of worship that they go to. There may be certain kinds of shops and stores that our target audience shops at. There may be neighborhoods they live in. There may be sports that they like to play. There may be places they just hang out. There may be clubs they belong to. There may be advocacy groups they belong to. If you are looking for somebody who is going to be volunteering in some kind of environmental capacity, the Sierra Club would be an obvious place to seek them. If you're looking for people with particular kinds of skills, you might ask, who employs people with that skill here? And we can go see if we can get a chance to talk to them through the employer. There may be some professional associations, which also would be good for that. And there may be online communities where we can find them in some cases. So at this point, I think I'm supposed to turn it over to Sarah. So,
yeah, so
just for a minute, and I'll be back in just a second.
All right. Thank you, Rick. And you're absolutely right. Now it's time for us to hear from one of our VISTA members, Sarah Penn. So Sarah started out as a VISTA back this past August of this year. She serves as a project manager for My Brother's Keeper initiative in the city of Augusta, Georgia. And this is an initiative that is housed in the mayor's office there. And as you might know, My Brother's Keeper is a White House initiative to provide mentoring to young men of color. And the VISTA project sponsor in Augusta is the United Way of the Central Savannah River area. So Sarah, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm excited to be here. So just to develop a little bit more in case people are wondering what My Brother's Keeper is, like Andy said, it is a White House initiative that President Obama launched in February of 2014 to address persistent opportunity gaps facing boys and young men of color and to ensure that all young people can reach their full potential. The My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge seeks to inspire community leaders and encourage their commitment to ensuring all young people can succeed. The My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge encourages communities to convene leaders, identify effective strategies, and work together toward achieving 6 specific goals. So I'll go through those just really quickly. The first goal is ensuring all children enter school cognitively, physically, socially, and emotionally ready. Number 2 is ensuring all children read at grade level by 3rd grade. Number 3 is ensuring all youth graduate from high school. Number 4, ensuring all youth complete post-secondary education or training. Number 5, ensuring all youth out of school are employed. And number 6, ensuring all youth remain safe from violent crime. So today I'm going to speak on goal number 2, ensuring all children can read at grade level by grade 3. To impact this goal, the Mayor's Office in Augusta created the Power Lunch program. This is a reading literacy program and a milestone of the My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge that our mayor committed to in 2014. In the Power Lunch program, an adult reading mentor is paired with a 2nd or 3rd grade student who has been identified by their teacher and school principal as performing below their expected reading level. The reading mentor meets with the same student at the student's school during the student's lunch hour on the same day each week. Books are provided by the Power Lunch book drive we hold throughout our community. The volunteer opportunity we are trying to fill is reading mentors. So pertaining to the first 4 steps discussed earlier by Rick, the job that needs to be done is a volunteer reading mentor. Who would want to do this job? Really anyone who loves children is a good candidate for this job. Anyone who loves to read, for example, retired teachers, empty nesters, college students, etc. What would they do instead? They may spend time reading with their own children or grandchildren. College students may spend time reading and studying. And where will we find them? We can find them at various businesses, churches, government buildings, and universities throughout our community.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. One of the things about that, you'll notice that she had a number of target groups down there, and since this is aimed at young people of color, I think, you might also look at successful people of color as a target group for that. the more target groups you get, the more messages you can come up with that would specifically appeal to those folks, and the more narrow the target group can be, the better. So the next question in our list of questions is, what method will we use to communicate to our target group? And that kind of comes out of the previous question of where will we find them. If there are physical locations where the target group can be found, then maybe a poster or a brochure in that physical location would be a good method. If there are groups that they belong to, then getting an invitation to speak to that group would be a good method. If there are, if they're sitting home watching television or listening to the radio, we might think about a public service announcement as a method of getting to them. There are and we also might think about media interviews for that. I was talking to a volunteer coordinator in Southern California, Los Angeles area once, and she was having trouble recruiting volunteers for a kind of peer crisis line thing that she had. And she said she had plenty of volunteers during the evening, but she was having a heck of a time finding volunteers during the day. And I said to her, what's the problem? She said, well, everybody I talk to has a job. I said, well, where are people who don't have jobs, young people who don't have jobs? And she said, oh my gosh, yes, they're going to be either at the beach or at the mall. And in both of those cases, a little booth that she arranged to put up was the thing that attracted their attention and got them over there. The one on the slide there that may bear some explanation is beer coasters. I was working in England, and this guy asked me, he said, I run a student volunteer program here at the university. I'm trying to get students to volunteer. And I said, well, what do they do instead of volunteering for you? And he said, well, they go down to the pub. And so I said, well, how will we communicate with them at the pub? And he had this brilliant idea. He had little coasters made, because in all the pubs in Britain, when you order a beer, they put a coaster down, set the beer on it. And he had some coasters made, and he got the pub to give out. And on one side of the coaster, it said, do you have time on your hands? And then on the other side, there was a little recruitment message for his volunteer program. A big one is internet sites, and with that one, one of the key things there is to looking at your own internet site. There also are recruitment sites. The biggest one is Volunteer Match. The second biggest one is probably Idealist, and they both kind of work the same way, where you send them a recruitment message and they put it on their site. Your own website is also a really important recruitment tool for your organization. And one thing, it is often hard if you just think about somebody who wants to volunteer and who knows you do what you do and they're interested in being involved. If they go to your website, is it obvious and easy for them to find out how to volunteer? And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's completely opaque as to how you might go about getting involved. One of the things about these internet recruitment sites is that people who seem reluctant for one reason or another to actually step forward and go physically to an agency will sometimes feel more comfortable exploring opportunities online. Volunteer Match found that 75% of the people who volunteer through Volunteer Match have never volunteered before. And their statistics in Australia are even higher. I think it's around 90%. So it is an effective method. The next one of these is what motivations are likely to move them to action? And this is kind of revisiting our original thing about who would want to do that, and looking at just kind of reviewing and identifying those things. And the reason that we do that is because this all boils down to the last step, which is to craft a message. What is it that we are going to say to our target audience? So I'm going to show you some examples of targeted messages. About 5 of them, I guess. And all of these are posters, which isn't to say that a poster is the way to go about recruiting. These are all posters because it's easy to show you the message on the poster, and you can kind of quickly get the idea here. So the first one of these is to get retired men to volunteer. It comes from Australia. So you might think about this. What are some motivational needs of retired men? What are some of their concerns? What are some of their fears? What are some of their dreams and values? Meet friends, I see. Yes. Feeling useful. Very good. Okay, that's enough. Yeah. Socialization is a big one, and feeling useful is a huge one. That's a lot of you said that. When you're working and people are introduced to you, you tend to respond, and they say, what do? You tend to respond with your job title. And now that you're retired, you're not a job title anymore, and, you know, am I still a useful person? So this poster I want to show you, which comes from Australia, I need to explain one thing about it. In the, over here, you know, when you buy some milk, it says sell by date on it. And in Australia, that's called a choose by date. So here's how here's their message to try to appeal to the needs of both socialization and having friends and feeling useful. And the line in the middle, I don't know if you can read that easily. It says, set your own choose by date. In other words, you can decide when you cease to be useful. And I thought that was just a brilliant way. And the socialization is obviously caught by these two guys who are having a good time. One of the things about this that I would point out, they got a graphic designer to volunteer to design this, and sometimes graphic designers will do things that are artistically pleasing to them, but which may get in the way of the message. And even if I showed you this poster, just held it up in front of you, it's really hard to read yellow type against that white shirt. And so the key message is something you might not actually pick up on if you weren't looking for it. So that's one criticism I would have of that particular poster. But obviously, retired men, the spokesperson is obvious there too as well. The next one is aimed at getting people to teach children to read, and the target group that they identified was people who love to read. So where would you find people who love to read? Libraries would be a good one, and this poster hung in libraries. This is from Right to Read. It hung in libraries all over the country for a while. There was a big campaign of this. The other thing about people who love to read is that they often loved to read as children, and they had favorite books, and books that they read over and over, one of which would be The Secret Garden. And you can see on this poster, it says no entry on the secret garden. And at the bottom, it's a different story when you can't read. And somebody who loves to read would think, boy, that's just horrible. They can't get in the secret garden because they can't read. And I thought that was a really great recruitment message. The next one is aimed at young African-American men, get them to volunteer. Might volunteer for Sarah's organization, for example. So what are some of the motivational needs of that target group? Income, jobs, equality, yes. Purpose, yes. Respect, I like respect. Empowerment, yeah. Okay, so respect, empowerment, and kind of part of that is a sense of having to work harder than other people because of my race. This is actually an AmeriCorps poster. It says, even the odds, and you can see the young man there standing sort of above the children in a position of some authority. They're looking up at him admiringly, and he's going to work with them to even the odds of them being successful. I think it's one of the best Vista AmeriCorps posters I have ever seen. The next one of these is aimed at getting people with disabilities to volunteer. And one thing about people with disabilities is they may hear your recruitment message, or they may see your recruitment message, but they may assume you're not talking to them. And in those cases, the spokesperson becomes an extremely important part of the message, either in person, having a member of a person with disabilities to deliver the message, or a picture that the target group can relate to, so that they know we're talking about them. Here is the message. This comes from England. My wife has cerebral palsy, and she uses a wheelchair. She looked at that poster, and her immediate reaction, without a second's hesitation, was, that's me. And that's exactly what you want the spokesperson to do. Also, going back to African Americans, there's a statistic that keeps showing up in the Gallup survey, which is that African Americans in the U.S. volunteer at a lower rate than other groups, but at a higher rate when asked. And that often baffles people because we think we're asking them, but they're not coming to us. But maybe you're asking them in a way in which they don't think it's them that you're talking to. And so, again, the spokesperson would be a way to deal with that. The last one I want to show you is actually targeted at me. Work for beer, really good beer. The Seattle International Beer Fest has run this ad in the newspaper for the last 20 years. They only run it for one day, and they have people pouring forth to volunteer. It is again, an example of sending a message that that the people who already want to do the job can just see, okay, I've got an opportunity to do that job. So I'm going to turn this back over to Sarah now.
Okay, so with the Power Lunch program here in Augusta, we've had we've experienced success by communicating with the public about our need for volunteers through the use of posters, city employee email blasts, contacting our local news station for a press release and on-air interview about our program and the need for volunteers, and collaborating with the mayor and our community outreach coordinator on strategic partnerships with businesses and universities in our city. One example of a strategic partnership we have is there is a large ADP presence in our city. They have established a volunteer coordinator for employee involvement within the community. I've also had success contacting directors and managers of different departments in the building I work in. I found that if the director or manager is passionate about the cause, they may include their entire department to participate and volunteer in your program, and this results in less work for you. One example of a barrier we have experienced is how close the volunteer site is to their place of employment. We found for this particular project that people will likely participate if the location is within a 5 to 7 mile radius of their place of employment, just because this is during, most of the time during their lunch hour. So if it's a little bit closer to their place of employment, they have time to get back. So then moving on to what motivations are likely to move them to action. Wanting to make an impact on a child's life and making a positive difference in their community are both examples of this. It is helpful to give them impactful information about how your program is making a difference, because this can create motivation for them. An example of this in Power Lunch is that studies from the American Educational Research Association show that a student who can't read at grade level by 3rd grade is 4 times less likely to graduate by age 19 than a child who does read proficiently by that time. This can also lead into the question, what will we say to them? Using powerful statements and action verbs in your communications to potential volunteers can make a big difference. There are a couple examples I've listed, like transforming lives and participation in a life-changing endeavor for the children of Augusta. We've used both of these in communications to our volunteers.
All right, excellent. And just to kind of summarize all of this, we will be more successful in attracting volunteers who are actually the kind of volunteers that will meet our needs if we can target our message and get people who already want to do this to step forward. In every community, there are people who are concerned about the same things that your organization is concerned about, and there are people out there who want to do the things that need to be done. It's one of the great things about America is there are people who want to do everything that needs to be done. Some of you may be in small and more rural settings, in which case I would encourage you to think about could there be some volunteer jobs that actually could be done online by volunteers. This is a new trend in volunteering. It's not really new anymore, but there is probably the ultimate example of this was that there was a Girl Scout troop in California that was being disbanded because they could not find somebody to be their leader. They went online and recruited somebody from Michigan who volunteered to be the Girl Scout leader, and they met online in the chat room, and that enabled them to keep the Girl Scouts going. So rather than sending one message, try to target your message to the person you're talking to. Also, when you're doing this, you're going to make some assumptions about what the motivational needs are of the person. When you actually have a person in front of you, they may not have the needs that you would assume that that person would have, and so the retired man, for example, might not have a concern about feeling useful, and so you just need to kind of get to know the person and go with what motivates them. If you have questions about this in the future, feel free to call me. My cell phone number is up there. And also you can send me email at that email address, and I'll do my best to get right back to you. So I'm turning this back over to Andy now.
Great. Thank you, Rick. Thanks for that generous offer of your warranty and follow-up, and thanks to Sarah for sharing your experiences. So we know that you likely have questions for our presenters, and we're going to get to those in just a minute. But before we do, I just want to let you know that we really do look forward to getting your feedback on today's session. So we've opened a poll on the right side of the screen. There are 10 simple questions. You need to use the scroll bar so you can see all 10. But please take a moment to fill those out. If you have ideas for what we could do differently or other topics we could offer, please put those in. We look at every one of your responses there, and we use those in planning our future sessions. You'll also notice that the Q&A and chat panels have collapsed or closed. You can just click the triangle next to those to reopen them. So we are going to move into the question and answer portion of our presentation. And I'm going to invite Aaron, our operator, to come back on the line and give us instructions for how to ask questions over the phone. Aaron?
Absolutely. If you would like to ask questions on the phone, please press star and then 1 on your touch-tone phone. Unmute your phone and record your name, as your name is required in order to introduce your question. So again, that's star and then 1 on your touch-tone phone, and it will take a few moments for any questions to queue up on the audio.
Great. And while we're waiting there, I'll also mention that you can reopen the Q&A panel. Click the triangle next to the letters Q&A. The panel will open, and you can type your question in and then submit it, and we will get that lined up as well. So I don't see any questions right yet in the Q&A, so here's your chance if you want to be first. All right, so first up is Sarah. She says, how do you motivate long-term volunteers and make them feel important? So this gets a little bit out of the recruitment realm, but so it's sort of keeping the volunteers that you've already got. So Rick, I don't know if you want to summarize.
Yeah, this is a whole additional topic, but basically, if the problem is that the volunteer seems to be losing interest, then maybe the solution to that might be to change their job. Sometimes a person will start volunteering, they really like to do it, it's meeting their motivational needs, and then something changes in their life. And those motivational needs are not nearly as important as other concerns that they have. And so if you can kind of keep tabs on what's happening with your volunteers and look at maybe adjusting their job so that it continues to be something they really want to do. The other thing is that one of the trends in volunteering, which has been going on for the last 25 years and keeps gathering momentum, is that people are reluctant to volunteer for the rest of their life. And so one of the things I think is a style of volunteering is what I would call serial involvement, where people volunteer for a while and then they go do something else with their leisure time, and then they come back. And they are more likely to come back if you don't try to pressure them or guilt them into staying and to allow them to leave. So those are just a few comments on
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. I know it's a huge topic, and maybe we'll do a whole webinar, and we have done in the past, on volunteer retention. Next up, Abigail wonders if you have any ideas for recruitment for walking school bus chaperones in a small rural community.
Well, you know your community best. I don't exactly know what that job is. Is that somebody who's kind of monitors the children's activities?
It's sort of like you were describing before. It's where there's not a physical school bus, but the children walk to school together, and they go down the block. And you know, as they stop in front of a student's house, he comes out and walks in a group within their, you know, our chaperones to go with them.
I wasn't familiar with that.
Yeah.
Well, if it's, I would say, parents of children would be one likely one. If it's a dangerous neighborhood, you might go to the target groups mentioned before. If it's a community in which there might be some retired teachers who would still like to kind of interact with the children, maybe a couple of years after they retire, that might be a target group. Most people do like children, and they would be willing to do it. Another thing about making that job more palatable to today's people is to think about it in terms of maybe not doing it every day, but doing it on some intermittent basis, or having a time-limited period would make it more attractive. So.
All right, all great suggestions. Erin, let's turn to the phones and see if we have anybody on the phone line.
I currently show no one in queue at this time.
Okay, great. Well, we've got some other questions here. We'll move on. So Emily asks, how do I use targeted recruitment without playing into what she thinks could be harmful stereotypes? For example, you know, macho men want to escort children through the dangerous neighborhood.
Well, yeah, and once you have a volunteer in front of you, it's important to realize that your target group assumptions are based on the fact that people who make up these groups do tend to have things in common, but of course within the group there are there's lots of variety. I mean, there are you know, you would think that people of color would tend to be of a certain political persuasion, but there are lots of them that are of an opposite political persuasion. So that is something that you do need to keep in mind. The other suggestion around this is to get members of the target group to help you craft the message, or to at least run it past them before you send it out to make sure that it is likely to be effective.
And Sarah, I'm curious if you have any thoughts or perspectives on this from your work with Power Lunch or the other aspects of the My Brother's Keeper program.
Can you explain a little bit more in detail? Like, you want me to develop on?
Well, so Emily's question was, how can I use targeted recruitment without playing into stereotypes?
Okay, so I mean, with this program, the My Brother's Keeper initiative is and has been developed to address persistent opportunity gaps facing boys and young men of color, and that is, you know, that's a focus, but with this Power Lunch program, we don't exclude anyone from it. The children are chosen based on reading scores, and then so we, you know, when we're looking for volunteers or when we are, you know, recruiting for volunteers, we don't particularly go for, you know, any certain group. We try to focus the message on more about the children and, you know, who loves to read, who would really enjoy volunteering for the program.
Okay, great. So you focus more on motivation rather than characteristics.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
All right. So next up, Mary has sort of a different issue. She says, how can we recruit if we have non-exciting tasks, like folding newsletters, putting labels on envelopes, and that kind of stuff?
Let me respond to the two above that, too.
Oh.
The thing about the director having a limited view of what volunteers do, although this is an extreme example of that, I think it is a common frustration of people in the field of volunteer engagement that directors of agencies have a very limited view of what volunteers can do. It's as though volunteers are a different species, and you know, they tend to be thought of as unreliable to do anything significant. And as a consequence, organizations are less effective. I think a lot of social problems in this country could be less if nonprofits involve volunteers in more significant ways in solving those problems. But that doesn't really answer your question about how to do this. But one thing you might try to do is see if you could get a particular, if you could talk to the director and kind of ask them about, are there parts of your job that you don't like doing? Maybe if you could find a volunteer that wants to do whatever that is. You might also ask, if you had the money to hire an additional person, what would you have that person do? And then see if you could ask them if they would consider having a volunteer do that. You might actually, one of the problems might be the word volunteer, and you might say, I think I could find somebody to do that pro bono, because that that has a different cachet than volunteer. People think of volunteers as doing useful ancillary tasks, but somebody who's contributing professional skills pro bono is a completely different thing. So you might try that approach. And then to Stevie, yes, I would love to find out about Skate Like a Girl. So the non-exciting tasks, there are a couple of strategies there. One is to take them to a place like a senior living facility where it's not really the task so much as the opportunity to get together and socialize and do something useful at the same time. That would be one strategy. Another strategy would be to look at people with developmental disabilities who would find it actually more challenging and interesting. My wife works in the field of employment for people with developmental disabilities, and they often start by volunteering. So every county in the United States has somebody in charge of that program, so you might check and see. So that's that.
All right, great. Yeah, and I'll just echo, I was a volunteer manager, and we had lots of boring administrative tasks. And we did like one evening a week. Thursdays, we would have kind of open volunteer night, no pre-registration required, drop in. It was very social. We played music. People could bring their favorite music, plug it into the sound system. We would order pizza. It was so popular, we had to like put a limit on the number of people who showed up because we would run out of work for them to do. They didn't really care about folding newsletters. They didn't mind it. They thought it was a good cause, and they were willing to help support it. But really for them, it was the social opportunity.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, so Lauren is wondering if the same strategies that you talked about for targeted recruitment could be used to design an invitation to encourage people to come to an event to share their ideas.
Yes, I think probably some of the same thinking is likely to be true. You know, and if that event, by the way, is a fundraising event, one of the methods on my thing was open houses, or fundraising events or another one. In addition to asking for money, you can also ask people for time at fundraising events. I was just at one where I got the director to try this, and it worked pretty well. They were auctioning things off and asking for pledges of money, and then she got up and said, some of you have more time than money. Who's willing to give us 50 hours a year? And there were quite a few takers on that. And then she said, how about 10 hours a year, and that got more people involved with that. So, yes, I think it does apply.
All right, terrific. So Michelle says she works with people who have strong apathy toward their neighborhoods. So she's wondering, how can she change their minds and get them to work, or I'm assuming maybe volunteer, with their neighborhood association?
Yeah. Well, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry. Getting people to change their mind and to care when they don't seem to care, I don't know. If we could solve that problem, we'd solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, the only thought I had from what you were talking about earlier, Rick, and the whole idea of motivation, what motivates people, is to see if there's a way to have a conversation with some of them to find out what they do care about, what's most pressing for them, or what's, top of mind, and then see where there may be overlap with the things that the neighborhood association is doing. So, someone might not identify the neighborhood association as a group that's working on what they care about, but in that conversation, some of that could possibly be uncovered, and maybe there is a natural connection there. Let's see, next up, Andrea wonders, what kind of messages are overdone? I've heard that things like, "we need you," are not appealing to volunteers because it's something they've seen 1,000 times already. Are there common phrases that we should avoid in our recruitment messages?
I think rather than worrying about that, you should just try to write something that's appealing, and somebody who feels like, like my mother-in-law, where her children don't seem to need her anymore. It's a big need of hers to feel needed. That message, "we need you," would be something that would motivate her. But yeah, there are, if you get bombarded with those messages all the time and you don't have a strong need to feel needed, then that's not going to work. But just try and start with what the motivational needs are to begin with.
Mm-hmm. All right, next up, do you have any advice or tips for recruiting block ambassadors?
Can you define that?
It's not defined here, and I'm not exactly sure what that means. I mean, it could be something like a neighborhood association involvement, but there's no more information here. So maybe we'll move on. And if that was your question, Shalante, feel free to put more in the Q&A, and we'll come back to it. Next question is, what's the best way to recruit highly skilled volunteers into a position that requires a lot of professional experience?
Yeah, I think this is a rich opportunity that a lot of organizations could profit from, because no nonprofit agency will ever have enough money to hire all the people it needs, and sometimes there are people who will volunteer that particular skill. I think the question is, it is often true that somebody who does that all day doesn't want to volunteer and do that some more, and so getting somebody who has retired from the position may be more successful than getting people who are actively engaged, although that's not always true. Sometimes that's not true. But that's a general strategy. I love the question because I think there are rich opportunities there, and if you can get one highly skilled professional volunteer to have success, then that starts to open up staff's minds about other kinds of highly skilled volunteers that they might have the opportunity to involve, and it can really make a difference.
Yeah, and Rick, I'm reminded of a resource you mentioned earlier, Taproot Foundation. So that could be a great resource for those who have very particularly highly skilled positions they're trying to fill. All right, so we've got some questions that are kind of a field of recruitment, so we're going to focus on the recruitment questions first. If we have time, we can come back to some of the others. Yep.
Throw in a plug to Mary Warren. Check out Better Impact as the software for tracking volunteer hours.
All right, and I just have to give our standard disclaimer that because we mention a resource here on this webinar does not constitute an endorsement from the Corporation for National and Community Service or the AmeriCorps Vista program. Thank you. So we have to say that, of course. We do like to mention specific resources as examples of what we're talking about, but obviously we can't promote one over the other. But we always appreciate hearing what people are using that works and those examples, and invite people to check them out and figure out what's going to work best for you.
Can we do the diversity question?
Yeah. So Scott wonders, how do you prioritize diversity in your recruitment process?
Again, I think this is what targeting is about, and you can start with a target group, and the more narrowly you can define it, the easier it is to target. So African Americans is too broad, for example, of a group because it contains all kinds of subgroups. So African American women would narrow that down. African American retired women would narrow that down further. African American retired teachers would narrow that down further, and then you could look at what are the concerns of that group, what are the dreams and hopes and desires of that group, and then can we come up with something that would allow them to feel fulfilled by the volunteer experience. And then in that way you might create the job after you actually have the volunteer in hand. So, trying to attract them in with the message, and then it's not really going to be so job specific as it is related to their particular set of likely needs.
All right. Let's see, Cooper has an interesting question. Is there a good way to utilize current volunteers in recruiting new volunteers?
Yes, that goes to the concentric circles approach, and one way is just to encourage them to talk to their friends and see if their friends would like to come forward. Another is to have an event in which you have current volunteers and staff invite at least one person to come, and the pitch is, would you be willing to come and just learn about what our agency does, and to tell them we're not going to ask you for money. And then during the course of that event, you can go around and talk to the people, get their contact information, and find out a little bit about the things that they want to do in some of their motivations, and then have the ability to call them back.
All right, great. So we've got a few minutes left, so I think we'll be able to get to a few more questions here. So Sarah says that she works in one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the U.S., in Anchorage, and one of the biggest problems she faces is communication across the many different cultures. So how should she go about recruiting and marketing in this area where there are so many different potential audiences?
Well, again, I think coming up with a message that appeals to each of those groups and sending it out through whatever mechanism. If you're speaking to one group, you might stress a particular thing they're concerned about. If you're speaking to another group, you might stress something that they're concerned about. It might be that they wind up doing similar jobs, but you've attracted them with different messages because people will want to do the same thing for different reasons.
All right. Next up, Erin has a challenge. She's focused working in government housing neighborhoods, and she says many of the residents do not want people coming in from outside of the neighborhood to try to help. But then when Erin tries to recruit from within the neighborhood, she can't find any reliable volunteers. So any suggestions for that situation?
Reliable, I assume, means that they do it for a while and then stop, or don't show up when they say they're going to show up.
Sounds like.
Usually that means that maybe they were willing to do it, but it was something they were willing to do but didn't really want to do. And so part of that might be to see if there's a role that they could play with you that would be something that they would more really want to do than just be willing to do. So people who volunteer and do something they're willing to do will do it for a while and then slip away. And the people who continue to volunteer are people who find it very fulfilling to them because it meets their motivational needs.
All right, so Shante came back and gave us more information about block ambassadors. So block ambassadors are concerned residents who want to play an active role in transforming their neighborhood into a safer, friendlier, and thriving community. Their primary role is to represent the concerns of the residents living on their block. And so she was having some trouble in looking for advice or tips for recruiting those block ambassadors.
Well, one thing you might look at is, back when I was at Vista in Atlanta, looking for people who are sort of natural community leaders, and the way to find those people is who is it that has a following. So is there somebody on the block that people take their troubles to, or who is well liked by everybody, and see if you can then sit down and do a one-on-one targeted recruitment and ask them about what their passions are, what they're most interested in, and see if you can craft a role for them that would enable them to meet those particular motivations.
All right, great. So I think we've got time for one more question. Let's see, you can see a couple of these, Rick, as well. I'm not sure where we should go. Grace has a question. She says, for targeting potential recruits, what are some groups or individuals that would be willing to volunteer at outreach events, such as working at our organizational booth, at events to talk to people about our organization, to raise public awareness of environmental issues and get people to sign up to volunteer in the future or be a supporter of our organization? That could be a great question for everybody who's on the session.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great brainstorming.
There have been some really good suggestions in this Q&A. There haven't just been questions. There have been some suggestions that are quite valuable. For each of those things, I would look at, again, who would want to do that. So you would look at speaking about our organization to groups. Who would want to do that? One possible target group would be Toastmasters, which is a group that helps people overcome their fear of public speaking and helps them build confidence. Another, and this may seem rather strange, but high school students would be another one of the most exciting volunteer programs I ever saw was in Columbus, Ohio, where they took kids as young as 14 and trained them to lead tours of the Science Museum. And so you'd see like a 14-year-old telling a group of adults how electricity worked, for example, and it just did wonders for their self-esteem, and they just absolutely loved it. So, and it became a thing in the high school that, volunteering for the center of the Central Ohio, I forget, COSI was the thing, Science and Industry is the last part, for the Science Museum was just the cool thing to do. They didn't have to do any recruiting anymore because people were beating down their door to volunteer. So that might be another target group. For people who are raising public awareness of environmental issues, that, again, people who might belong to advocacy groups around the environment, depending on the type of environmental organization or issues you're talking about. If it has to do with wildlife preservation, this might not be one you'd think of, but hunters are very interested in wildlife preservation, and so sometimes that's a very different target group. You need to get a very different message to them than you would to a member of the Sierra Club, obviously, but those are a couple of things off the top of my head.
All right, great suggestions all. So a huge thanks to you, Rick Lynch, for your presentation and sharing your wisdom and expertise here. I also want to say a big thanks to Sarah Penn, Vista in Augusta, Georgia, for sharing her experiences as well. And thank you all for participating today. Of course, we have more webinars coming up for you next month. Two are listed here on the screen. One is on making everything you do sustainable, so it's getting the most out of the effort that you're putting forth. And the other is on how to use your Siegel AmeriCorps Education Award. The dates are listed there. They're at 2 p.m. Eastern. You'll get emails inviting you to participate. They're also listed on the Vista campus. So thanks again for your participation, and we hope to see you again soon.